Bienvenue. Welcome to Massey Dialogues. My name is Nathalie Desrosiers, and I'm the principal of Massey College, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here, our in-person audience and also our virtual audience. So to first acknowledge that Massey College is built on indigenous lands, the lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and it is the treaty land of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We want to acknowledge our duty of stewardship toward this land and also the great privilege that we have to continue to do our work here. I'm really excited today to welcome someone that has come to Massey from the United States. Thank you to Senior Fellows for suggesting that we invite some international scholars to come to Massey and visit. So I'm very delighted that Professor Tchumkam has agreed to do that. He holds degrees from Université Sorbonne Nouvelle Paris 3 and the University of Pennsylvania. He's trained as a comparatist. His field of interest are post-colonial studies, literary and political philosophy. Numerous essays, book chapters on contemporary fictions and connections to the former French colonies, including France, hexagonal France, the Caribbean, and North Africa. He's the author of an essay on post-colonial migrations in Africa and its diaspora, entitled Exil et migration postcoloniale, France face à ses banlieues, a collection of essays on the relationship between state power, politics, and citizenship in contemporary France. So, bienvenue, Monsieur Tchumkam. Ça me fait grand plaisir. So, as you will see, the lecture will be in English, but I'm sure that you welcome questions either in French or in English, and we'll be happy to move forward. Hervé.
Thank you, Nathalie. I have my... Right, thank you very much for making the time to be here in person or online. I want to thank Massey for hosting me. Special thanks to Nathalie and Alisa for the wonderful organization. I will be talking today briefly about France's colonial legacy in Algeria and the Paradox of Grievability. I should maybe start by stating that this research project stems from my first book, not the recent one, and my first book aimed at understanding the political, sociological, and philosophical conditions surrounding urban uprising that struck France in 2005. In that book, I studied the invisibility of visible minority, and that study led me to get interested in the group, the Harkis, who shares both similarities and differences with the social group of African immigrants and their descendants in the French banlieue. After more than a century of French occupation, Algeria became independent after a war that lasted 8 years. During that bloody war, some Algerians, known as the Harkis, aided the French army for various reasons. The term Harkis has also been extended to refer to any Algerian who favored the French presence over the National Liberation Front. As you know, the FLN, National Liberation Front, was the political party that led Algeria to independence with many ups and downs. We could come back to that in the discussion. As in Vietnam, an act of war was never officially declared in Algeria, which made it easy for me to forget its tragic consequences. This talk will focus on the Harkis, those Muslim Algerian loyalists who served as auxiliaries in the French army during the war from 54 to 62. They were later abandoned in Algeria, where many were eventually massacred by the FLN, or for those who successfully fled to France, they were contained in camps. The permanence of violence in post-war does not only remind one of colonial violence, but it points to important questions about the respect for human rights. More specifically, it raises the question of the value of a human life when this life is faced with sovereign power in Algeria or in African context in general. So very quickly, we know that France had occupied Algeria since 1832. With the independence in 62, that's almost a century and a half of colonialism. With time, and especially at the turn of the Second World War, where colonial troops from Africa had helped France get rid of German occupation, Algerians also started asking for their own independence. We certainly remember May 8, 1945, crucial date, which is the day when France is celebrating its victory over Germany in France. But paradoxically, it is on the same day that Algerians who made initiative to ask for independence were massacred by the French army. November 1st, 1954 also will come to be remembered as the Toussaint Rouge. It is believed to have marked the beginning of a bloody war that lasted 8 years, like I said earlier. In this context of colonization, Algerians were forced to be secluded at home, and their properties, their land, were confiscated. It's also worth that at the same time, Algerians were promised French citizenship if they chose, which never really happened. Again, we could get into these details about the uncanny citizenship of Algerians in the Q&A. It's important to remember that until June 1990, France never referred to what had happened in Algeria as a war, at least for two reasons. According to French historian Benjamin Stora, considered one of the best world experts on Algerian history. These reasons, Stora argues, are both ideological and budgetary. In fact, had the so-called events been recognized as a war, France would have had to indemnify thousands of wounded and traumatized among the 1.5 million soldiers who had fought in the war. On the ideological part, it's also important to return to the civilizing mission to understand that it would be a stark contradiction for France to claim that they are civilizing and yet doing it through the means of a war. When France was about to lose Algeria, they made a very interesting decision. And I want to put interesting in quotes here. They disarmed the Harkis under the pretext that they would provide them with new weapons, and then decided to abandon them in Algeria and return to France. Like I said, many of these Harkis were massacred as a result of this abandonment. I should, however, specify that in June 1960, the FLN, the main nationalist party, had sent a letter to the Harkis warning them of what would happen if they sided with France to maintain Algeria under French colonial rule. An excerpt of the letter reads, I'm just going to read a short one. Faithful to his tradition, colonialist France the blood of its children, and as always, uses foreign blood in its wars against the people it wants to maintain under its domination. Now, reflecting on human life is an influential work, Homo Sacer, Sovereign Power and Bare Life. Political philosopher Giorgio Agamben elaborates on the work of Foucault on biopolitics, talking about the mechanism of control applied on individual bodies. Agamben proposes the citizen lives are put at the disposal of sovereign power. His theory rests on this enigmatic figure or signifier of the Homo Sacer. The Homo Sacer being in ancient Rome, a person whom it was not permitted to sacrifice, and yet whose killing was not considered homicide. So, drawing on Foucault and Agamben, I suggest that the notion of sovereignty in Africa, or in Algeria in this case, implies that the sovereign has power over life. My investigation into the Harki shows that this group epitomizes the crisis of human rights in a post-colonial context, given their exclusion in France and their rejection by the Algerian independent state after the war. Although the Harkis do not constitute a biopolitical analog to Agamben's enigmatic figure because their horizons in French camp is not defined by death, I would, however, argue that although their treatment does not correspond to necropolitics in a biological sense, it seems that the area where they share the status of the Homo Sacer is the paradox between the sacredness of their lives as humans, so as humans their lives are sacred, and yet, on the other hand, their murder, either by popular violence or by means of abandonment in Algeria, has remained unsanctioned. Furthermore, I maintain that the bodies of the Harkis were both object and target of power in France and Algeria. From that standpoint, I therefore contend that the Harkis suffers a political and social death while being key part of French claims to sovereignty, right up to March 1962, when the Evian Accords were signed finally. In his book, The Harkis, The Wonder Hills, Vincent Crapanzano remarkably charts how the Harkis' sense of identity has been shaped by discrimination and humiliation, with their imprisonment in camps until the mid-1970s. Building on interviews of Harkis and their children, Crapanzano contends that the Harkis are victims of the outcome of French colonialism in Algeria. He shows successfully how the singularity of individual witness underlines the multiplicity of experiences in the context of exclusion and relegation. Another scholar, French historian Pierre Dôme, historian and journalist, in Le Dernier Tabou, has argued quite convincingly that many Harkis who remained in Algeria after the exodus continue to be victims of inequitable treatment by the Algerian government, a situation that needs to be underlined and understood. On the one hand, the Harkis are depicted by those nostalgic of French Algeria as patriots while being reduced to silence in France. Whereas, on the other hand, the narrative of Algerian war in Algeria still considers the Harkis as traitors, and they treat them as such. Their memory is therefore torn between celebration and rejection. The direct implication, human rights implication of the Algerian war, in a post-colonial context has to do not only with the Algerians who perished or survived the war, but also, and maybe even more importantly, with the Harkis who were used, then sacrificed. Building on Crapanzano and Dôme, I investigate not only the various categories of the Harkis, but furthermore, I would like to interrogate the relation between ideas of victimhood and the responsibility of Harkis who, for some, made deliberate choices to side with the French army and administration. So this project, which is at an early stage, will consider the following questions. How does one take critical issues with themes of accountability and reconciliation in order to attempt to restitute a memory and give voice to the disenfranchised who gave their lives to France in the struggle? What is given to death, and how does this place determine the value of the human body? Additionally, I seek to understand what becomes of the citizen when the boundary is blurred between their sacredness, as I said earlier, which is their entitlement to justice, and their expendability, which is the fact that they are, as human lives and bodies, they are expendable. What state mechanisms ultimately function to blur these categories? To attempt to answer those questions, and again, this is a very early stage of the research, to attempt an answer to that question, I would borrow the notion of camps and bare lives from political philosopher Agamben, as well as the notions of traitors and patriots, to understand what remains of the value of the Harkis when these lives are stranded in necessity and expense. These questions that guide my inquiry into the politicization of life, which is the transformation from mere life into political life, that seems to have become the basis for the ultimate expression of sovereignty in Algeria, and more specifically, more generally in Africa. And here we come to ungrievability and its direct implications. Judith Butler insists that grievability governs the ways in which living creatures are managed, and it proves to be an integral dimension of biopolitics and of ways of thinking about equality among the living. I would like here to just do a pause and signal the intervention of Robert de Vernejoul, who was a medical professor of medicine, who interestingly took a side after the war in Algeria about the reasons why Algerians, the Harkis, shouldn't be repatriated to France. Whatever de Vernejoul argues, to me is interesting insofar as it clearly points to the entry of biology into politics. When we are talking about repatriation, it is suppose a debate that's left to politicians or political scientists and so on and so forth. But to have a professor of medicine make an intervention into this is reminiscent of Foucault's plague and leprosy. So one reading into this could be that The entry in dialogue of a medical doctor would suggest, as we've seen with colonial ventures, that these Harkis, or these Algerians, Muslims, presented a problem of public health as such. The challenge to human rights with the rejections of Muslims has come to bear many consequences. Many Harkis who had massacred their own compatriots were at their turn massacred in Algeria after the war. Although the French government had given clear orders not to repatriate Harkis to France, some officers did those orders and brought many families along to France. And in France, these Harkis and their family were, so to speak, incarcerated in camps. This is if we consider the camp as, I quote, the space that opens up when the state of exception starts to become the rule. It is in fact the most biopolitical space that exists, because in the camp, human beings are reduced to a pure biological life, and they face sovereign power with no mediation whatsoever. Once again, I want to point out that the Harkis were both used and then promoted to sacrifice. But rather than drawing towards a conclusion with facts or deductions, because it's still at an early stage of a research, my closing remarks will be in the form of question, and I will talk a little bit about the question. Returning to that question, how do we take critical issues with themes of accountability and reconciliation in order to attempt to restitute a memory and give voice to many of the disenfranchised who gave their lives in the struggle? Among other theoretical considerations, I will submit that the Harkis have become some sort of Heimatlosen, like Hannah Arendt, that is, the stateless for whom powerlessness has become the major experience of life. Once again, looking at concepts such as camps and bare life, as well as the central interrogation on religion, Islam, as the element that sparked the abandonment of the Harkis in Algeria, as well as their social disqualification in France, the ultimate question that this research will seek to elucidate remains about the value of the human life when these humans are stranded between necessity and expendability and reduced to their pure biological life. While these questions remain to be fully investigated and answered, I would like to finish by saying that the Harkis remain transient citizens, true stateless people that are not fully French nor considered citizens of Algeria, where they are to date still not welcome. For, as Judith Butler puts it in her work, In the Force of Nonviolence, a prohibition against killing, for instance, applies only to those lives that are grievable, but not to those who are considered ungrievable, meaning that those were already lost, and thus they never fully had enjoyed the life. In consequence, my takeaway is that the unequal distribution of grievability has to be addressed if an ethics of nonviolence is to presume and affirm the equal values of lives. The colonial legacy of France in Algeria can ultimately be said to have operationalized ungrievability by enacting policies that subjected the Hark abandonment and death, and in short, it did summarize the lives of the Harkis as lives that were from the start considered as disposable, wastable, and dispensable. So those are the few remarks that I had, and like I said, I would prefer that we go further in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you for happy to field the questions to Professor Tchumkam, and I'll start with my own then while people are thinking about what they want to say. So that's the Harkis. Are they still people in France in camps, or are they now just, it's 60 years ago almost. So what's the current legal status that they would have? It's
an excellent question. The current legal status is that they are French citizens. That having been said, it's a French citizenship bereft of the psychological entitlement of Frenchness. For many French, and we probably remember George Fresh, you know, addressed to them as losers and people who are unable to stand for their own cause. I'll argue that in short, despite all the attempts, you know, through discourse or speeches of the French state, you know, Macron recently and Hollande before him, despite all of that, my contention is that the Harkis will have full access to humanity only when there will be a true revision of history and an acceptance on both parts, both in France and in Algeria, of the wrongdoings that surround their history.
And so, and do we know, I mean, so their children and their grandchildren are presumably on French soil, and the mystery or this sense of grievance must be transmitted from one generation to the next?
Yes, definitely, and I think it's very interesting because during the field work that I did in France, interviewing some of them, it's lukewarm, you know, some stand by their fathers, others clearly say that their fathers dishonored the family. So again, it's this issue of choosing in a post-colonial context.
Even choosing now.
The youth side, and even now, it's still a big deal. However, much to our surprise, it doesn't seem to the attention of the French state as an issue to deal with. The Harkis have been used repeatedly as political expedient. They come up in debates, coming before the elections, and thereafter they are forgotten. So, and that's why I got interested, you know, looking at the banlieues, which are, you know, populated mainly by people of Afro-descendant ancestry. And I realized that there was another category of Afro-descendant people who have different issues, similar and different issues with the banlieues.
So, Alexis? Why don't I give you the microphone so that people online can hear your question?
Thank you very much, Hervé. Thanks for the nice presentation. I just wonder about the issue of Frenchness. How specific and different is it for Harkis in particular? Because understanding is there's just so many groups in France that are perceived as not French enough. So you see what I mean? Of course, they come before the election, then it disappears again. And I remember this wonderful documentary, Passé Blanche pour être Française, which you know about. So how specific is the case of Harkis? Why is it so contentious? And is it different from others? Is it not the more common problem than it tends to be?
Thank you very much for the question. Excellent one. I think, like I said, they share both similarities and difference. Similarities because of their African ancestry, but clearly difference because, in a sense, and this is something that I came up, you know, in my first book about the banlieues, the children in the banlieues of, let's say, over-stigmatization have come for many of our generation now to interiorize their African ancestry. So when you talk to them in, you know, comparison, on the banlieue sides, they say we are rejected by France, but at least we know where our parents come from. The Harkis say we are rejected by France, but we cannot even go back to Algeria, claiming that we are descendants of Harkis or we'll get in trouble. So that's what made me think of those Heimatlosen, in the sense that, yes, they might carry French citizenship passports, and yet the psychological entitlement of Frenchness, they don't seem to enjoy them because they are used as political expedient. So I think it's certainly a group, the descendant of Harkis, that deserve additional interest, you know, from scholars. A lot have been done in France, but I think bringing in these theoretical and philosophical configurations can help draw or shed a new light on the ways in which identity formations are result in what I call transient citizenships. So it's a citizenship that's always in transit, in a sense. They are French, but they don't feel fully French. And as you said, even talking about the banlieues, there is this break between the so-called native French and the second generation French. The Harkis, however, or their descendants, seems to not belong to any of those categories. So they are in some sort of limbo, identity-wise. I don't know if that addresses the question.
Of course, in post-war France, there was a general movement to out collaborators. And while naturally race and religion are additional elements, I'm wondering if there was any influence of the sort of anti-collaboration. Like, how can you condemn collaboration in France, with the French who collaborated with the Germans, and yet praise collaboration of the Harkis? I'm just wondering what sort of impact that might have had.
I think it's very good, and that's precisely one question that I had at the beginning of this. In the title, I speak of the paradox of grievability, right? Again, I will return to May 8, 1945. As African troops, including thousands of Algerians, are liberating France, the same France is punishing the Algerians in Sétif for asking what them, the French, have been fighting for against the Germans. And that irony, building on Butler, that irony has to do with, again, I would say racial classification, you know. And this comes up a lot in, even with students in the United States. They ask me, why did the Algerians need to go to war, you know? And then I turn the question around, why did the Americans need to fight the Brits? And then they start telling you it's different. I'm like, what's different? So again, this difference speaks to what Butler talks about when she mentions grievability. So different, it will be worthwhile for those who are already considered humans, and for those who are reduced to the status of object, there is a contention there. Why do they have to fight? Why don't they just, submit and let themselves be subdued by colonial power? And again, no matter how you turn it, unfortunately, and this is something that I tell my students, in my opinion, it comes down to classification, with that dichotomy of the world with a few superhumans and the rest less than humans. And we could even push it further, and what I'm about to say is very contentious, but I will try to say it. I observed, speaking of grievability, during the Ukrainian War. All of a sudden, Europe rediscovered international law. But I was appalled watching those images where non-Ukrainians were beaten off the trains trying to run away from bombs in Ukraine. And again, if you couple that with the coverage of incidents that happen in the West, compared to the coverage of incidents that affect the so-called third world, then you're forced to ask your question about, are all humans really humans? Philosophical question, but obviously all humans are humans, but are they treated as humans, as such? That would be the central question here.
Thank you for the talk. My question is, do the Moroccans suffer from the problem?
Do the Moroccans suffer for the same problem? Excellent question. My answer would be no. Yes and no. Yes, because as a post-colonial land, obviously they suffer from the legacy of colonialism. But they do not suffer from the same issues precisely, maybe also because Algeria, unlike Morocco or Tunisia that were protectorates, Algeria was a settlers' colony. So you had thousands of Europeans in Algeria from the invasion of Algeria in 1830. And moreover, like I said, I could come back to it in the discussion, Algeria was considered an extension of France, and yet Algerians were not French citizens. So I think from the very outset, it was already flawed. The situation was already as the disadvantage of Algerians, and then if you move to civic citizenship versus ethnic citizenship, it's also worth underlining that the Crémieux Decree in 1870 gave French nationality to the Jews and denied it to the Algerians. So all the way from there already there was a type of very strong stigmatization that will come to, get to its apex with the war and then exodus and or the massacre of those who remained in Algeria.
Thank you. This is another dated question. My knowledge of Algeria is very old. Did Albert Camus' work have any influence on the political development?
He did in a sense, and if you remember his novel, The Stranger, right? The Stranger has had many readings, but post-colonial reading of The Stranger is precisely the depiction of, and Fanon also is influential in here. You know, Algeria unveiled, the use of women in Algeria. If you want to break them down, start by unveiling their women. So that's how I would very briefly read The Stranger by Camus, right? But then Fanon would argue, and this will be the line of the FLN, that the veil that's supposed to be a weapon of control turned around and backfired and became a weapon of liberation for Algerian women. Obviously, the discussion could be more complexified if you look at women in Algeria post-independence, but at the time, at least, it was a scene of empowerment, of agency for the women.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Other question from? Let me ask you just why did you get so interested in this? Like, how did you get to work on this subject? Is because you were studying les banlieues first, and that's how it came, the complexity of their not being, but not being able to return. Is that how it came?
Yeah, in a sense. I mean, basically, as they call it post-colonial studies scholar, I'm interested in these formerly colonized areas, right, with a special emphasis on the former French Empire. But like I said earlier, my work in the banlieue has really drawn me towards the Harkis. And I mentioned Benjamin Stora. He has an essay about like the weight of forgiveness and oblivion. And in that essay, Benjamin Stora clearly states that the treatment of Afro-descendants in France today could be attributed, albeit partially, to the former colonial relation between France and the colonies in Africa. And when I looked at that and inquiring in the banlieue, not that I didn't know about them, but it really struck interest because some of the Harkis children would say banlieue kids are complaining, and yet they are better. At least they know where they come from, like I said. At least they have an origin. We don't know where we come from, and if we were to be ousted out of France, we wouldn't know where to go to. They, at least, by filiation, not that they will be happy, but by filiation, they could trace back their origins and return to a country where it would be difficult, but where their entry wouldn't be as problematic as it would be for them in Algeria, for the Harkis descendants. I don't know if that addresses the question.
Well, if there's no other questions, I just want to say merci beaucoup. Thank you very much for enlightening us. And please come back to College anytime and come back to Toronto. It's always a pleasure to have visitors come and share their wisdom and the work that they're doing. Merci encore.
Merci
Thank you.
grandement, Nathalie.